Okay, Professor Nicholas, I think we're starting. So right now I'm going to introduce you in Russian to the audience, and then the floor is yours.
Excellent.
Да, всем здравствуйте, кто в аудитории, всем здравствуйте, кто в Zoom, всем здравствуйте, кто смотрит нас на YouTube. Сейчас у нас будет выступать профессор Джеффри Николас. Джеффри Николас занимается тем, что изучает современную католическую и аристотелианскую традицию в политической мысли и смотрит на то, как она может совмещаться с критическими теориями, например, там, Хабермаса, Фуко и вот такими ребятами. Вот. Сегодня он представит доклад на тему того, что такое свобода и как она связана с сообществом, и как это отношение понимают разные традиции мысли, такие как либерализм, республиканизм и неоаристотелизм. So, Dr. Nicholas, the floor is yours. You could start.
Thank you. I want to begin by thanking Ivan Baronoff, the other members of the organizing committee, the European University of St. Petersburg, and the Moscow Higher School of Social and Economic Sciences. I also want to greet and thank the other speakers, especially those who did not run and hide when they saw my name on the program. I'm most delighted to be here. I apologize that I cannot stay for the whole conference. As I explained to Ivan, I'm running my own conference this weekend for the Center for Contemporary Aristotelian Studies in Ethics and Politics. CASIP.org. You're more than welcome to go there and look at what we do. I wish to recognize as well that I'm working and living on land and territory originally occupied by the Narragansett and Pequot peoples of Turtle Island. They have never ceded this territory. I'm a firm believer in the land back movement, which holds that settler colonial powers like the United States should return land to indigenous peoples, not only out of respect for them and reparations for the harm caused, but in recognition that only through leadership of indigenous peoples will humanity find a path through disaster to continued existence after the climate collapses. My intention was to speak on liberalism, civic humanism, or what I shall refer to in the following the literature, republicanism, and neo-Aristotelianism. That is really too much to cover in the time that we have, so I will keep my remarks to republicanism, focusing on Philip Pettit's masterful work here, and some contributions that Professor Charles Taylor has made to the Republican understanding of the common good, and then focusing on Alistair MacIntyre's neo-Aristotelian approach. What we need to remember from liberalism as a third tradition are two things. First, the centrality of the principle of non-interference as articulated by John Stuart Mill, and then restated along Kantian lines by John Rawls. And second, the notion of public reason as articulated by both Rawls and Jürgen Habermas. I had intended as well to address perfectionist liberalism as stated by Joseph Raz, but will not be able to do so. What a discussion of Raz would add to our topic is an understanding of how autonomy fits with the principle of non-interference. In my lecture, I wish to distinguish republicanism's concept of freedom as non-domination from the principle of non-interference. As we will see, Pettit believes both are necessary for effective republicanism. Second, we will examine the place of the common good in Pettit with assistance from Taylor. While Pettit articulates two features of the common good, Taylor identifies three types of common good. Finally, we will look at the notion of reason in political debate in Pettit's republicanism. While Pettit does not eschew non-public reason to court, he does exclude it from political debate. In the end, this understanding of public reason becomes self-defeating. I hope to show further a limitation of Pettit's approach through a discussion. Well, actually, I'm not going to have time to do that, so we'll just ignore that for now. But that will depend on timing. So after pointing to these features of Pettit, I will spend some time discussing MacIntyre's neo-Aristotelianism. Perhaps I will spend a greater time here given my standing in MacIntyrean studies, but I do so in order to clarify a few points that others in the dominant literature simply get wrong. my focus will be on McIntyre's positive conception of freedom, on the notion of common goods, and on the reason of traditions. The natural law will also be relevant, but I caution that my interpretation of natural law is not McIntyre's. The third section of the lecture will discuss Pettit's approach to environmentalism, and then mine. Again, here I will diverge from McIntyre, although to be fair, McIntyre has not written on nature or environmentalism. So to begin, we'll start with republicanism, or civic humanism. Republicanism provides an alternative to liberalism's notion of freedom as non-interference. I say it's an exception because Philip Pettit, leading defender and expositor of republicanism, holds that civic republicanism embraces non-interference as well as non-domination. Here, he distinguishes between republican freedom as he understands it and that promoted by Quentin Skinner, though Pettit admits little of substance differentiates their accounts. Where Skinner understands republican freedom to include both non-interference and non-domination, Pettit holds that only formal republicanism requires non-domination, while effective republicanism requires both non-interference and non-domination. This inclusion of non-interference as a principle of freedom raises for us the question, which we hope to answer, of whether republicanism is a part of the tradition of liberalism or a separate tradition altogether. To begin to answer that question, we need to look at freedom as non-domination. Republicans cast their notion of freedom as non-domination with the contrast between the free citizen and the slave. Someone is free when they are, quote, not subject to the arbitrary power of another. That is, someone who is not dominated by anyone else, end quote. This definition entails that liberty is lost even if someone does not interfere with a person, from the mere fact that such a person or entity could interfere. Moreover, in a second contrast with liberalism, one can remain free even if interference occurs when such interference arises from a non-mastering interferer. For civic republicanism, slavery's opposition to freedom comprises, quote, the single most characteristic feature of the long rhetoric of liberty, end quote. The import of this point lies in the fact that a master may not interfere with the slave if, for instance, the master is benevolent or permissive, yet the slave remains unfree. One imagines, of course, the ideal slave under the Roman Republic, the Greek tutor of the family whose master does not interfere with the tutor's work or direct it in any way. In the US context, Phyllis Wheatley might come closest to this idea. A slave to a benign master, she was able to write poetry, study today, and her masters would work for their white visitors. They also It provides his own example of the American colonies under the British Crown. The Americans objected to being taxed arbitrarily. It was possible for the Crown to tax the colonies to the last penny, even if they were never likely to do so. And this made the colonies unfree, that is, dominated. Interference, again, may not be arbitrary and therefore may not be a form of domination or violation of freedom. A policy or act is non-arbitrary, according to Pettit, when it tracks or, quote, is controlled by the interests and opinions of those affected, being required to serve those interests in a way that conforms with those opinions, end quote. Laws, for instance, of a republic, ones that are constituted in a proper manner, and we'll talk about how that happens later, might interfere with people's actions and lives, but does not comprise domination. Instead, that citizen, that is, republicanism does not claim that laws that interfere are just because they provide some good compensation for the loss of freedom. Rather, good laws do not violate but create freedom, even if they interfere. The rule of law becomes a defining feature of republicanism along with citizenship. One can dominate another when one has a capacity to interfere on an arbitrary basis in the choices that the other can make. Domination requires that the capacity makes the other worse off. Interference cannot take the form of a bribe or reward. Such interference must also be intentional. An accidental interference, for example, my exiting the door when you want to enter, does not count as domination. Since acts of omission can interfere with another, they too can be exercises of power, such as a landlord who fails to rid your apartment without raising your rent. Such actions need not be illegal. If I stand in the doorway, perhaps because I like the flow of air at the spot, and prevent you from entering the establishment, I am legally permitted, but still interfere and in fact harm you. Finally, the interference must be arbitrary, dependent only on that person's choice. My choice to stand in a doorway is arbitrary, arising only from my interest to feel the fresh air blowing in. Interestingly, non-domination under Pettit's view is a form of power, a control that a person enjoys in relation to their own destiny. And such control constitutes one familiar type of power, the power of the agent who can prevent various ills happening to them. So underneath Pettit's argument is this idea that the Republican tradition gives the agent power to act, right? That's what freedom consists in. Here again, non-domination is not merely the absence of interference, but a security against it. Such security is not something one can achieve on one's own. I do not think that the existence of multi-billionaires such as Jeff Bezos testifies against this idea. Money, of course, can protect people. In fact, does protect people, as we see with the trials against Donald Trump right now, from interference in many ways, and does allow those same people to interfere in the lives of others in an arbitrary way. Yet money protects only so long as people allow it to protect the individual with money. I shall put this point aside. The more relevant one for understanding Pettit is that individuals are incapable of securing non-domination, but that the state is able to pursue that goal fairly effectively. So here he is arguing that he's not defending some form of anarchy. He's simply saying that the only way that we can have freedom or non-domination in our lives is to have a state that secures it for us. Non-domination comprises what Pettit calls communitarian goods. A communitarian good is social and common. As social, the good is realized only when a number of people display intentional attitudes and perhaps intentional activities. As common, a good cannot be increased or decreased for one without being decreased or increased for other members of the group. Pettit gives the examples of clean air and external defense, right? So this is something, if we want clean air, then it requires the intentional attitudes of all involved to make sure that the air stays clean. And I cannot enjoy cleaner air than you without decreasing it for other members in the group. So non-domination is a social good in that it requires checks on the capacity of other people to exercise domination. And non-domination is a common good because no one can interfere arbitrarily with one's own interests without being able to so interfere with the interest of others of your group. In that sense, then, non-domination, freedom as non-domination, is what Pettit calls a communitarian good. More formally, Pettit defines the common good as the public interest, or quote, those interests which people have in common qua members of the public, end quote. Citizens identify their interests through dialogue in which they grant certain reasons a status that all members accept as having weight, even if they do not grant the same weight to each reason. In contrast to status reasons are those reasons that would justify, for instance, the self-interest of some members. I like to stand here in the doorway, and that's my privilege. Or that provide an advantage over others. Money should be all that matters in society, and I have a lot of it. Or that a preference, a cause of, or that a preference, a cause of ideal not shared by all would not achieve the relevant status. So if I have a preference for something that everyone does not share, then we all do not, then it does not get the status of a common reason. Status reasons would include, on the one hand, neutral considerations that concern the general prosperity of the group or its efficacy in attaining agreed ends, or the assurance available to each that no other members enjoy any particular privilege, and on the other, more personal complaints that members of different groups may raise against various proposals and that secure us acceptance as reasonable. Thus, reasons that refer to how the community might sustain itself. We need to protect this river and create a dam here, or that refer to harm done to specific groups. If we dam this river, then we're going to harm the people that live on that side of the river. Those things count as status reasons, reasons that some policy or action will make life more difficult or better for people. Charles Taylor helps us to understand Pettit's idea of the common good, though he uses different terms to identify three types. The Republican tradition holds that societies are animated by a sense of a shared immediate common good, IMMEDIATE. Convergent common goods are those goods that can only be provided collectively. They are already goods, such as safety from fire, but we need to pursue them collectively. Convergent goods seem to match the example of Pettit's social good. Mediate, MEDIATE, common goods for Taylor are valuable because they have value for us collectively. To modify one of Taylor's examples, Elvis Presley brings me joy, but my joy is increased when shared with you. It is, in Taylor's words, a quite different experience. In contrast, immediate, IMMEDIATE, common goods are goods where what centrally matters to us is just that there are common actions and meanings. Friendship is an immediately common good because it consists in actions and meanings that matter to us as friends. Pettit's idea of a common good as not being able to be increased or decreased might, for one of us, might fit here. However, it does not clearly define something distinct the way that Taylor's does. In this case, both social and common seem to apply to Taylor's immediate common good. Yet friendship is more substantive as it entails our acting and creating meaning together. Does Pettit's idea of communitarian goods, that is, the public identifying their interests through dialogue, mirror friendship? He suggests that it does, but to me, this model of friendship is closer to what Aristotle identified as friends of utility or pleasure, and not, as Taylor ideas seem to suggest, true friendship. Under Pettit's account, citizens do not so much make meaning together as simply identify commonly held interests. In identifying status reasons, we exclude what we do not share. Yet friendship, true friendship, becomes greater the more that friends can identify what they differ in and how those distinctions make them even more special. At least that is how I would identify friendship. For my love of my friend Brandon and his love of me is true despite, not just despite because he loves the Beatles and I love Elvis, but because he loves the Beatles and I love Elvis. On Taylor's account, the Republican common good is like Aristotle's notion of friendship, because the citizen is attached to the laws as a repository of his and others' dignity. Thus, where we share a convergent common good in the security afforded by an emergency weather service, and we share immediate common good in our playing a symphony together, we share an immediately common good in the solidarity of laws that arise from the value of sharing a fate together as citizens of this or that society. Now we must attend to another difference between republicanism as Skinner and Pettit understands it, and as Taylor does. The Republican tradition contends that this notion of common good means that the citizen shares responsibility through active participation in the state. Participation on the Republican tradition, however, is not participation in a self-determining polity. People should have a sufficient civic virtue to be willing to participate in political life. Yet freedom is not, on this idea, identical to that virtue or the right to participation. Freedom as non-domination requires that one lives under a system in which the sole power of making laws remains with the people or their accredited representatives, in which all individual members of the body politic, rulers and citizens alike, remain equally subject to whatever laws they choose to impose upon themselves. Thus, Pettit insists that the Republican tradition is not a populist tradition. Democratic participation is not one of the highest forms of good. For Pettit, self-rule is the ability to stand eye to eye with your fellow citizens in a shared awareness that none of you has a power of arbitrary interference with another. So as I said before, for Pettit and Skinner, the most important fact about republicanism is this ability to stand eye to eye, to have equal power. Taylor, in contrast, suggests that self-rule is not only essential to a life of dignity, but it also is the highest political good. So they have a stark disagreement here. Even more, Taylor says, participation in self-rule is the essence of freedom. Insofar, though, as self-rule is identified with participation, I think Pettit would reject the notion. This tension matters, I think, because it delineates the Aristotelian or neo-Aristotelian tradition from the Republican and liberal traditions. To be a citizen for Aristotle is to rule and to rule in turn. I contend that McIntyre's politics rest on this idea that participation in politics is one of the highest goods. So now I want to turn to McIntyre. For considerations of time, I will ignore the discussion of whether McIntyre or Charles Taylor are communitarians. McIntyre has denied it several times, and I'd be happy to address that issue in the Q&A. But let's turn that aside. Insofar as Pettit calls his common good communitarian, McIntyre would simply say, I am not communitarian. I turn instead to McIntyre for his positive notion on freedom and the common good, not only as contrast to the liberal and Republican ideas, but as pointing us in the right direction for modeling communities that will help human beings survive the imminent climate collapse, if we don't destroy each other through war first. Early in his career, when still an avowed Marxist, McIntyre wrote that the question of freedom is not a problem of the individual against society, but a problem of what kind of society we want and of what sort of individuals we want to be. Liberalism of both kinds and republicanism have the question wrong then, insofar as they take the center issue to be the individual against society. Freedom as non-interference clearly makes that the case, as Mill points out in his discussion. So too, however, does freedom as a particular kind of autonomy in Raz's discussion. And a republicanism that identifies freedom in relation to the slave as well centers the relation between state versus individual. McIntyre would not deny that individuals should be protected from the state. The point here is just that we can no longer think in terms of the state. The modern nation state is neither necessary or legitimate on McIntyre's account, nor can it provide a means for realizing the virtues. Instead, these states are governed through a series of compromises between a range of more or less conflicting economic and social interests. Not goods, but bargaining power determines the distribution of resources and the protection of rights. Of course, McIntyre doesn't believe in rights, but that's a different issue. The goods of the nation state are not common goods. When the nation state attempts to pursue common goods, it becomes ludicrous or disastrous, and we often end in some form of totalitarian regime. The ability of the Republican Party, and remember, the Republican Party in the US is not Pettit's republicanism. Those are two different things. So the ability of the Republican Party in the US and the Conservative Party in the UK, among other right-leaning parties in modern democracies, to force compromise so as to prevent radically necessary action to curtail climate change is both ludicrous, because self-defeating, as we will all die, human beings, but thousands, if not millions of species, including sentient ones such as whales, will disappear from the earth. This disaster involves mass death through starvation. We need then to address the two probing questions which McIntyre asks. What kind of society do we want, and what kind of individuals do we want to be? McIntyre addresses the second question, what kind of individuals do we want to be, in many of his works. One central theme stands out, that we want to be the kind of individuals who are independent, practical reasoners. That is, we want to be the kind of individuals who can direct their lives on the basis of rational desires. That answer points us to the kind of society we will want to live in, a society which supports our development as independent, practical reasoners. McIntyre identifies three steps to independent, practical reasoning. We must be able to step back from and evaluate our desires. We must be able to step back from and evaluate our reasons for actions based on those desires. And we must be able to imagine possible futures that depict different actions. We are not born with the ability to reason. We develop this ability in particular kinds of society and through particular kinds of practices and in allegiance with particular kinds of traditions. All three of these practices, societies, traditions allow us to identify our common goods through which we pursue freedom. Importantly, I will show that these kinds of societies are committed to something like the Republican form of freedom as a baseline, but not as substantive freedom. In Act of Virtue, McIntyre reconfigured Aristotle's practical philosophy, eschewing at the time a metaphysical biology by relying on a social theory of practice. A practice is a socially and historically established set of activities through which practitioners pursue goods internal to the practice by adhering to standards of reason, and in so doing, extending their conceptions of the good and their human powers. 2 points about this definition. First, few individuals writing on practices have understood what McIntyre means by internal goods. So if you're doing research on McIntyre's concept of practice and someone says something is an internal good, do not believe them. Those writing on management and in organizational studies are most egregious in their misreading. An internal good is a good that is highly specific and only achievable in this or that practice. Agility is not an internal good. However, the agility achieved by moving one's body through positions on a balance beam is an internal good that contrasts with the agility achieved by moving one's body in interpreting ballet music. A gymnast is not a ballerina and vice versa. They achieve something similar to each other, and each can most likely develop the other's form of agility better than someone not trained in those forms of practices, but they are still distinct in kind. Second, I hold that his definition is Marxist in orientation because it echoes Marx's notion of non-alienated labor. For Marx, expanding on Aristotle, human history is human action achieving ever greater expansion of particular human powers. That is, we perfect ourselves. Politics, we might say, is one form of specifically human activity through which we extend the powers of human freedom, or in McIntyre's words, making desires, intentions, and choices effective. I have an example here talking about Rembrandt, but I'm going to skip it and we can come back to it if we need to. In practices and tradition, we learn to identify, step back from, and evaluate both desires and reasons, and we hope develop an imagination. When entering a practice, one accepts the internal good, standards of reasons, generic understanding of the good of the practice, and the human powers aimed at as given but questionable. We find a basis from which to evaluate our desires. Do I really desire understanding another's history through art? Our reasons for action. Why do I paint these features and not those? And we take the first steps to imagining a future of possibilities. What is possible for me to paint, to capture through paint? But the purpose lies not in changing the practice, but in pursuing its goods with others. In doing so, I have to rely on traditions. A tradition is a socially and historically embedded argument about the good, human nature, and other fundamental agreements. As an extended argument, it involves the use and evaluations of reasons. So I give a number of examples here: Aristotelianism, Platonism, Kantianism, Roman Catholicism, Lutheranism. In my own work, I talk about the Azandi of North Africa, Szechuan or the Lakota of Turtle Island, and other indigenous peoples. If you want to explore this more, I suggest you look at McIntyre's Whose Justice, Which Rationality, or my own book, if I may be so crass, Reason, Tradition, and the Good. Salient for this conversation is the fact that these traditions are in fact arguments about the good. Further, such traditions have sub-traditions. So Catholics include Franciscans and Thomists who think one way about human beings, and Augustinians who think another way. At the level of traditions, we see parallels between McIntyre and Pettit. For Pettit, the internal goods of practices. That does not deny that all of these practices have internal goods which are worthy for me to follow, but I must avail myself of reasons for pursuing one practice or set of practices instead of another. Traditions help me to determine that. So Catholicism as a tradition might point me in one direction, and Aristotelianism might point me in another, and the Lakota tradition might point me into a third. What these traditions are really doing is helping me to understand my desires, and this leads us to the common good. Above, I noted that Taylor distinguishes between three common goods: convergent common goods, mediate common goods, and immediate. McIntyre likewise distinguishes between three common goods, and his analysis mirrors that of Taylor's. But I'm going to skip to his discussion of the common goods of the community. He would agree with Taylor that these common goods give our lives meaning just so far as we share a fate in adopting them as our common goods. But he goes further. The common good of a society are the members rank ordering the practices and other goods of their community. And so doing, they determine what resources to distribute to support this or that practice, including practices such as family. They also at the same time identify the forms of those practices within that community. The meaning and solidarity that Taylor identifies arises through this rank ordering of practices. Further, this rank ordering is in fact the practice of politics. Thus, for McIntyre, as for Aristotle and Taylor, participation in politics is the highest good. Now, I have a lot more to say about this, but I want to skip to the discussion of nature, if I may. How much time do I have left, Ivan?
You have about 15 minutes
15.
before the questions. So you have 15 minutes and then the questions.
Okay. I've said that our greatest threat is that of imminent climate collapse, and that liberalism has failed and must fail to find a solution for us and for our non-human siblings in the plant and animal kingdoms. Pettit addresses the issue of environmentalism as well as feminism, socialism, and multiculturalism in his book Republicanism. I am only addressing my differences with him here on the concept of nature. Pettit wants to argue that the anthropocentrism of his republicanism is not inimical to environmental concerns. He contends that even though republicanism concerns only defending human freedom and no other good, it can still appeal to radical environmentalists. Who are these people? Radical environmentalists argue, according to Pettit, in ways that will not appeal to anyone outside their movement. The claim that the state should be shaped with a view to non-human as well as human interests is too specialized, too intimately associated with a particular perspective on the world to have the sort of general validity for political debate. So when I said before that Pettit finds some reasons have a status within the society and some do not, but they're still reasonable, this is exactly what he's talking about, right? The reasons that radical environmentalists give do not have the status in the state, but they still might be reasonable. McIntyre would say either they're reasonable or they're unreasonable. In asking why one should be moved by agreements from others, one does not accept. Pettit shows that the neutrality of his own form, Pettit reveals the neutrality of his own form of political debate and denial not only of the ability to evaluate his own reasons, but also of the nature of reason as bound by tradition. Further, where Pettit argues that politics in a pluralist society inevitably requires pragmatism, he articulates one reason why free communities will never exist in the modern nation state. It is not that the nation state is pluralistic that undermines human freedom. Rather, it is that the nation state insists on pragmatism that undermines the discovery, co-construction, and articulation of desires, and thus the rank ordering of common goods. Thus, in almost sneering terms, quote, the purest environmentalist attitude is also exceedingly precious. Why should devotees of a certain cause shrink from presenting that cause in terms that have general appeal? The answer, of course, is that all causes are specific, and insofar as we appeal to the general, we devalue and denude our cause. To appeal, as environmentalists have done over the last 30 years, to the general interest of human life robs that appeal of what is most important and motivating about it. Further, it presents the appeal in terms of the dominant force, that of self-preservation. When it comes to self-preservation, as Horkheimer and Adorno showed, the state and the market always win out, as we have witnessed year in and year out until we have reached, for the last 12 months, the 1.5 degrees Celsius that the Paris Agreement determined as the ideal goal of environmental action. Having articulated his argument against the preciousness of environmentalism, Pettit makes an argument for why the Republican tradition should make laws to address the environmental crisis. First, he writes, the ecosystem provides a place in nature. It is the space ultimately where we belong. Thus, he says, we are what we eat. This place is part of the fact that no human being is a natural island, but that we live in physical, biological, and psychological continuity with other human beings, with other animal species, and ultimately with the larger physical system that comes to consciousness in us. Given that link, our link with all of existence, when one degrades the environment, one in fact harms us, including our chance for survival and or the chances of our children and grandchildren to survive. Thus, we are, according to Pettit, physically vulnerable in our shared environment. That vulnerability entails that damage to the environment is damage to the range of undominated choice. In other words, it harms our freedom. Harm to the environment is a form of domination, or one should say arbitrary interference in our choices. Pettit's response is a set of reasons that arises from a particular Western or Eurocentric tradition. It is already precious, in his own words. In arguing that his reasoning is general and appeals to a larger audience, Pettit makes the same mistake that Rawls, with his public reasons, and Habermas, with his communicative rationality, make, which is to blindly identify their Eurocentric form of rationality as universal. thereby colonizing the rationalities of the majority of peoples across the world. This form of liberal or communitarian reason inadvertently takes on racist tones in Pettit's own work. In his discussion of multiculturalism, Pettit argues that mainstream culture may need to recognize how they have dispossessed minority cultures. And so here he's thinking about Native Americans, for instance. Further, it may be impossible to provide restitution or full compensation. How do we provide compensation for all the land that we have taken from the Native Americans? If further succession from the main culture is taken off the table, so Native Americans can't succeed from us because they're scattered throughout the United States, it may be necessary, according to Pettit, for the mainstream culture to treat members of the minority cultures as conscientious objectors to mainstream ways and to allow them various exemptions from otherwise universal obligations. It may be necessary to allow members of the minority culture to have a limited jurisdiction over their own territories, for example, and to organize their own affairs in a collective manner. Here, Pettit colonizes the concerns of Native Americans, not only by talking generally about individual struggles, but by imposing a European value system and set of reasons on those outside of Europe. Let's consider, for instance, the Oceti Sekawan. In 1867, Mapia Luta, Red Cloud, a war leader among the Oceti Sekawan, led his people against the US and won the war. This victory led to the signing of the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie, which granted
Professor Nicholas, we do not hear you. And at that time, it's not the problem on our side, I guess. А друзья в аудитории, кто другие, нас слышно? Или в Zoom? Да, в Zoom. Нас слышно. It's okay, I guess. Professor Nicholas. Professor Nicholas.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so we hear you, I guess. Could you say something?
Sorry.
No,
we're fine. Okay, so I'll go back to where I was. So there was a victory. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I guess right now it's much better.
Okay. So gold was found in the Black Hills, and this led to Americans violating the treaty with the Oceti Sekawan. This violation led to future wars, which eventually saw the victory of the U.S. over the Oceti Sekawan and the placement of the Oceti Sekawan in prisoner of war camps, or what most U.S. people call reservations. In 1979, the U.S. Supreme Court agreed that the U.S. violated the treaty and awarded the Oceti Sekawan $17.5 million with interest. The Oceti Sekawan refused the award, and it sits to the tune of over $1 billion in a bank. Why? Because for the Oceti Sekawan, money is not of value. Pahasapa is sacred territory. It is the center of the universe. That is why they fought almost to the last person against the U.S. Army. To claim, as Pettit does, that the Oceti Sekawan should accept the restitution is to speak a different language, to offer reasons unacceptable to the Oceti Sekawan. For them, Owning the land is crazy, like owning one's mother. This historical example not only exposes the Eurocentrism of republicanism, it also attests to the different ways that Europeans and those outside of Europe think about the land, the earth, and the environment. Here is where I would differ dramatically, I think, from Professor McIntyre. I recognize that European thinking, including the thinking of Roman Catholicism, has failed. And it has failed because of the aspects of its tradition that see nature only through its value to human beings, and specifically to men. We must first look to other traditions, such as that of the Ochetti Cycle One, to find reasons and practices that protect the environment, not for our good, although that is part of it, but for the value of the earth itself. In my case, I argue that nature must be understood as a partner in any community attempting to reach the common good, as articulated by McIntyre. We may have lost our ability to understand nature, but that does not mean that we cannot find it. In fact, the imminent environmental collapse means that we are in dire need of finding the ways of communicating with and respecting nature. Nature is a part of our community, not in a generic sense, but in a real sense that this river or this forest or this sea is a member with full standing in the community in its discovery of desires. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I guess we're moving to the Q&A session. So, кто-нибудь, у кого-нибудь есть вопросы в аудитории, в Zoom? Поднимайте руку, у кого есть вопросы. Если есть в Zoom вопросы, можете писать в чат, можете тоже поднимать руку, мы дадим вам слово. Well, I guess I could ask the first question, and maybe then the other will do that also. Well, thank you for your, thank you for your talk. It was great, but I want to ask, or maybe, so in your talk, you say that Republicanism and Neo-Aristotelianism, especially McIntyre's project, are completely two opposite views. So they have two opposite views on the good, they have two opposite views of the reason, and etc. But I think that we could combine them, and maybe it would be good. So Republicanism maybe is incoherent political theory, but it could be an effective institutional framework for something like McIntyrean local communities. So because we cannot rely just on local communities, we still need a general framework because we live in a nation state and we cannot get rid of it. And I guess McIntyre completely agrees with that. In that case, we should take, I guess, Pettit's republicanism as a general framework for a state, especially because it is instrumental and not substantial. So we do not give a state the right to decide what is the good, or every local community will decide it for itself according to its particular tradition. But it still needs a general framework because it is the same nation state. And I guess if we choose republicanism, it still needs a framework. And I guess republicanism is just better than liberalism, so we could choose the former. I guess it's something like that. Could you comment on that? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Ivan. I think that in many ways I agree with you, and McIntyre might agree with you, so that McIntyre, when he talks about forming the community, and I addressed this in that big chunk of the paper that I had to cut out, talks about the framework for the community as established by the natural law. And so one thing that I think we could do is look to republicanism to establish that framework, like you said. What I would want to do is look at that in comparison to Murray Bookchin's idea of libertarian municipalism, and see where there is differences and balances, because I think that there's a lot of similarities between the two, but that Bookchin has at least worked out the steps into creating that. Like you said, I found republicanism much more interesting than I thought I would at first, My concern there is exactly how we approach the environment and how the framework's going to affect that environment. So that's my largest concern there. So can we do it in such a way that the framework allows us to act so as to protect the environment and to pursue the goods?
Окей, thank you. Есть еще вопросы, может быть? Если нет, я задам еще вопрос. So, well, I guess I will ask also the next question. I want to ask about, I guess Calvin Knight has an article with a similar topic where he discusses also Republican conception of something and liberal conception and new Aristotelian conceptions. And he says that like republicanism is just a first form of liberalism. So he just lays the road for the liberalism. So first you have a republicanism, and then it logically develops into liberalism. I want to ask, if I understand Calvin correctly, I want to ask you if you agree with that position and.
Which article are you referring to by Calvin?
Well, I do not really remember the title, but
Okay.
I guess it was in some of the latest like collection of essays, like Aristotelianism and something modern Aristotelianism, something like that. It was called.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I think that there's. I think I would disagree with Calvin because I think that republicanism does not have to become liberalism. I think there's enough of a framework there that if we really established those values and had the conversation, people would be more accepting of the idea of non-domination as the basic principle, rather than just non-interference, which liberalism is. I'd want to look at Kelvin's argument a little bit more clearly. I know we differ a bit on some of these topics, but yeah, that's as far as I could answer that question. It's a good question, though. Thanks.
Okay, maybe I like mispresent Kelvin's argument. So, если теперь у кого-то вопросы? So I'm just asking the audience if they have the question. Well, okay, then I ask the last question, I guess. Well, I want to ask about the nature and how McIntyre understands it, because I think that, well, in his discussion of John McDowell's work, in some of the replies to his critic, well, McIntyre, in some of the replies to his critic, he discusses an article where his position and the position of John McDowell's are discussed. And the author of that article, I don't really remember who that was, but he says that they are like on the same page, McDowell and McIntyre. But McIntyre in his reply says that he and McDowell are completely different because McDowell is very Kantian, and McIntyre, of course, do not believe in any Kantian thing. So I think if we, and then he goes on to, like he elaborates a little bit on his book Dependent Rational Animals, and he says that every animal, like wolves, dolphins, and etc., they impose a particular understanding on nature. So we have like a lot of different natures, I guess. So I think if we look at that direction in McIntyre's work, we could think that he is somehow close to what you discuss in terms of nature and how we could and what we can do with the environmental crisis. Thank you.
Yeah, great. I think you're exactly right. McIntyre is completely different from McDowell. In terms of nature, the problem I have with that reading of Dependent Rational Animals is that McIntyre is only talking about specific animals, and he's not talking about rivers and forest, right? Which is some of the things that I would want to include.
I'm sorry, could I interrupt you for a second? I read an article by McIntyre, which is like an early article, because when he was writing about the medical ethics and that stuff, and he wrote in one of that article, I could send you that article. He says that he talks about science and how we could improve our understanding of nature, and he says that we should think of the good of like forests and things like that. But that's the only like moment where I've seen that he writes something like that. I could send you that article.
Yeah, if you just give me the title, I have the article, so it's not.
I don't remember it on the top of my head, so I'll send you.
Yeah, I mean, if he says that, I'd want to look at it carefully and see exactly how he expresses that. Sorry, you know your material well, Ivan. So you've got me caught here on a couple of things that I either haven't read for a while or just aren't familiar with. If it's the article that I'm thinking about, I don't remember that line. Is it the one about human nature?
Oh, it's not about human nature. It's an article. He's a co-author in that article, and that is about medical ethics. I just don't remember it's something about medical fallibility or something like that. I could just look it up and then send you.
Yeah, I think you know, if he says that we should look at forest and natures, then I guess I wouldn't have much of a disagreement with him. I'd want to look at you know exactly what he's saying there. I mean, he does come from the Scottish-Irish tradition where that might be a prevalent kind of idea, and so I'd want to compare that with what the Lakota say and how they interpret nature. He did not, when he read my book, Reason, Tradition, and the Good, he didn't mention anything about nature. So so I'm a little surprised that he might have this view. Not necessarily, it's not inconsistent necessarily. It's just, I don't think that he's talked about it yet. And even if he says that we should think about forest, I don't think he would say that we should include the forest in the decision-making of the common good. And that's where I would, you know, think that we differ. But yeah, it's a great question. We should talk about this some more.
Okay, thank you very much. I guess the speech was great, so the audience has a lot to think about. So thank you very much. It was a great honor and a pleasure. I hope you the best in your conference, and thank you.
Thank you.
Так, да, друзья.